uncle, who was also a sergeant. And his uncle's name was Robert Mulvey, and he watched Mulvey nearly destroy himself after being involved in a corruption investigation, which led to the arrest of a number of corrupt police officers. And Mulvey turned to drugs and alcohol and was nearly destroyed. And there was a kind of bitterness that Stephen Holt always maintained. He felt that the police department had not done anything to protect his uncle. And this is a scene from, you'll see it ends up with his arrest, and it's really the beginning of his nightmare. It's East New York, Brooklyn, the 7-5 precinct, April 23rd, 1991. Inspector Thomas Newell and Sergeant Reggie Joblowiski, both of Internal Affairs, greeted Sergeant Stephen Holt. Holt met both men some months before when he was interviewed by them for a position in the Internal Affairs Bureau of the New York City Police Department. Shortly after the arrest in a major police corruption case in Brooklyn during 1990, Holt had responded to a departmental order issued by Police Commissioner Sean Nevins, inviting police officers of all ranks to apply for transfer to a new Internal Affairs Bureau. While both Newell and Joblowiski were impressed with Holt's intelligence, enthusiasm, and knowledge of corruption, particularly what he said about its causes and various strategies he thought should be used to contain it, they were not inclined to recommend it for transfer to the revamped corruption unit for two reasons. First, his age. He was, after all, the youngest sergeant in the police department. Second, his answer to some of the questions suggested that he needed more maturity. They were particularly concerned that he considered the elimination of police corruption not only a priority mission, but as a personal passion. Sergeant Joblowiski concluded in his report that Holt's application for transfer to Internal Affairs should be put on hold for a year or two to allow him more patrol experience and time to gain the necessary maturity. He wrote, "The applicant is very bright and will surely hit a fast promotional track. But at this stage of his career, his concerns about corruption allegations within the department cloud his objectivity and judgment." Today, though, Inspector Newell and Sergeant Joblowiski were not in the captain's office at the 7-5 precinct to discuss Holt's transfer application. Stephen was puzzled to see others in the room, particularly a few uniform officers with shoulder patches, identifying themselves as members of the Suffolk County Police Department. Inspector Newell made the introduction. "Sergeant Holt, this is Assistant Chief Phil Patelli, Chief of Detectives for Suffolk County. Detective Sergeant Brenda Murphy, who's in charge of the Homicide Division for the Suffolk County Police Department, and Assistant District Attorney Wallace Goss, Chief of the Suffolk County District Attorney's Homicide Bureau." The scene would have been comical with all these people jammed in the captain's modest-sized office, except everyone's face was so solemn. "These folks would like to ask you a few questions, Stephen. Any problem with that?" Newell continued. "None that I can think of, sir," Holt replied. Chief Patelli motioned to Sergeant Murphy and said, "Brenda, why don't you begin?" Sergeant said, "How well did you know police officer Scott Rubin?" Holt was immediately curious because Sergeant Murphy referred to Rubin in the past tense. "Not well at all. We both work here at the 7-5 precinct, but he works a steady tour supervised by another sergeant." "And who is that?" she asked. "Well, there are several. I don't recall their names." "Did you know two brothers, Hiram and Ramon Rodriguez?" Holt thought she's again using the past tense. "Who were employed by the Lieb Electrical Supplies located in the Bush Terminal in Brooklyn." Holt looked at each of the three people in civilian clothing who had been identified as officials from Suffolk County. He glanced toward each of the uniform officers, also from Suffolk but not introduced. He then directed a question to Inspector Newell. "Has anything happened to these guys?" "Yes," said Sergeant Murphy, not waiting for Newell. "They're all dead. Rubin, too. They were murdered." Holt shot out of his seat and, raising his voice, said, I think maybe I should speak to my SBA delegate before we go much further. A police officers' union, in Stephen's case, the Sergeants Benevolent Association, would be the first line of defense in such a situation. Inspector Newell stood and walked to where Holt was standing and said, "Sergeant Holt, that, of course, is your right, but I must ask you officially if you're willing to proceed with this interview." "No, sir, I'm not at least until I speak to my union representative and decide whether I should be advised by a lawyer. By the way, am I in custody?" Chief Patelli, assuming his best folksy manner, put his arm around Stephen's shoulder and said softly, "Of course not, son, and if you want to wait to consult a lawyer or a union rep, you can and you should." Inspector Newell said, Sergeant Holt, as a result of a preliminary inquiry, I'm authorized by the Police Commissioner of the City of New York to suspend you for a minimum of 30 days. And I'm directing you to immediately hand over any weapons you have in your possession and to surrender your shield. And finally, I order you to report to the Office of Chief of Detectives tomorrow morning at 1 Police Plaza at 0800 hours. Am I clear? Holt could feel the anger building. His cheeks were red hot, and he felt frustrated and humiliated. Yes, sir, he finally blurted. But the ordeal was just beginning for the young police officer, because it was Assistant District Attorney Wallace Goss's turn to speak. And clearing his throat for his moment, Goss clumsily removed from his inside coat pocket a piece of paper, orange in color and perhaps 3/4 the size of business stationery. He handed the paper to Holt, who did not offer to accept it until he noticed that Goss's hand was quivering. Goss solemnly intoned, Stephen Robert Holt, the grand jury of Suffolk County, hereby summons you to appear before it to give testimony in the matter entitled The People of the State of New York against John Doe. The name John Doe or Richard Roe is used in the identifying title of grand jury investigations when that body had not received sufficient evidence to name or charge a particular individual. Holt took the paper, folded it up, and began to leave. He stopped, however, at the door and addressed Newell and Jablovisky. What you two have done today is just disgraceful. Newell tried to interrupt, but Holt cut him off. No, Inspector. Be decent enough to listen to me. I assure you I will not be as disrespectful to you as you've been to me. I put my life on the line for the people of this city. I fought the corruption that this department permitted to fester and grow unchecked for decades. And now in the presence of strangers, you didn't grant me the common courtesy or fundamental rights you would give as a matter of routine to some street mutt who injured or killed a police officer. The room became eerily silent. Patelli was genuinely embarrassed by what had occurred. Even Goss looked uneasy. Holt finished. What you've done today is a huge mistake. You should all be ashamed to call yourselves law enforcement professionals. Suddenly, Holt was out the door, waiting for no complaint or comments. The following morning, Stephen Holt reported to 1 Police Plaza. There, Chief Patelli was waiting, accompanied by 2 Suffolk County detectives and a lieutenant from the New York City Police Department's IAB. They approached Holt, and Patelli said quietly but firmly, Sergeant Holt, please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Stephen complied immediately, allowing Patelli to recuff him. But when the chief began to give him the Miranda warnings, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say, Holt interrupted. No, don't you dare treat me like a perp, he shouted. I'm a sergeant with the New York City Police Department, and I damn well know my rights. Don't you disrespect me in front of other cops. Patelli raised his voice and said, son, I have no choice. It's the law. What wasn't the law, or a procedural requirement, was to march Stephen, handcuffed from the rear, through the hallway of the headquarters of the New York City Police Department, past cops, civilian employees, to an elevator, and then to the garage for his ride in a gated police van to the Suffolk County Jail. It was something that Holt would never forget nor forgive. And years later, he would certainly recall that it was April 24th, 1991, his birthday. He was 27 years old. Now, the reason I read this chapter is you can see the anger that this kid had, and justified anger. The story then is, or the mystery to solve is he the killer because of his anger, or is he the victim of a frame-up? So I hope you enjoy the book. Thank you. Thank you.